Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. Richard Pipes was Mr. Buckley's guest on Firing Line just a year ago to mark publication of his long-awaited history of the Russian Revolution. It probably never occurred to Professor Pipes during the many years he labored over a book called The Russian Revolution that he would soon have to explain which Russian Revolution he was referring to. The book is about the first Russian Revolution of 1917 and the events leading up to it. But Mr. Pipes is back today to discuss the events of August 1991, which many people believe amounted to a second Russian Revolution as momentous as the first. Richard Pipes is America's leading historian of Russia and the Soviet Union. He was born in Poland, educated at Cornell and Harvard, and has been teaching at Harvard since 1950. In the early 1980s, he was director of East European and Soviet Affairs at President Reagan's National Security Council. Besides the Russian Revolution, his best-known book is Russia Under the Old Regime, another title he may have to explain from now on. Mr. Pipes recently returned from the Soviet Union, or whatever you call it these days. The events of August revealed that the communist hold on Russia was far more fragile than anyone could have imagined. The question on the table today is whether a different United States policy during the Cold War might have brought the second Russian Revolution about somewhat sooner. Mr. Buckley, a healthy prelude to that discussion might be a concession from you that President Jimmy Carter might have had a point when he criticized our, quote, inordinate fear of communism.
Well, he might have had a point if our fear had been inordinate. But since our fear was not inordinate, i.e., they had, when he said that, 14,000 warheads, according to one calculation, 150 million times the power of the bomb that exploded over Hiroshima. It seems to me that no fear of that falling into aggressive hands could possibly be thought of as inordinate, except to the extent that you were interested in suicide. But I have been very much interested, Mr. Pipes, and I can't think of anybody better qualified to discuss this than somebody with your perspective. We all burst out with spontaneous joy on the 22nd of August. We'd won. I wrote a piece called We Won. Now, between the time of Hiroshima and the time that we won, I went from being a minor to being a senior citizen. And it seems to me that those years in between, relatively painless for me and for you, were climactically painful for millions of people. So we are entitled to ask, I think, ought to ask very quickly, from what we now know, how might we have accelerated the demise of this great totalitarian monster?
I don't think we could have done much about that. It had to collapse essentially of its internal crisis. And I think, if anything, we accelerated it by the policies adopted by President Reagan. Mm-hmm. I would not give him credit for the collapse, but I think he contributed to it by his, more than anything else, by his psychological willingness to stand up to communism. He was the first American president ever to criticize communism as such. Previous presidents criticized communist behavior, mostly abroad, but acted as if what ideology the Soviet regime pursues is its own business. And he attacked the ideology itself. That, I think, was very demoralizing for them. But to answer your question, I don't think we could have done much more.
Well, what did you make of Solzhenitsyn's statement at Harvard and then in another essay, in which he said that he detected a very definite lesion of American willpower between the early 70s and 10 years later when we pulled out of Vietnam and so on and so forth. And might it not be responsibly held that that lesion of willpower, if indeed it was such, added to the longevity of the Soviet regime?
No, not really, because ultimately what forced the regime to start tampering with it, and in the process of tampering with it, bring it down, was the economic crisis. And that was domestic. Now, we could have possibly in the 70s, and by we I mean not only the United States, but also Europe and Japan, accelerated the process of disintegration of the Soviet economy by withholding loans.
That's the example,
that could have been done.
That's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Yeah, that could have been done. But we really had very little influence over the Europeans on this. You know, they were the main suppliers, essentially, of credits and technology. And I was in the White House in 81, 82, when we tried desperately to stop this flow. And at one point even came to a head-on conflict with Europe over the compressors for the Soviet pipeline, gas pipeline. And we just couldn't win this battle because Europeans were very, very obstinate.
Even Mrs. Thatcher was against us.
Yes, everybody was against us. They accused us of meddling in internal European affairs, whereas all, in fact, we wanted is them to abide by the terms of the license agreements which they had signed. But there was nothing we could do about that.
Well, let's move back a little bit. Post Yalta and post Potsdam, something called the Cold War was, so to speak, institutionalized. Churchill came to Fulton, Missouri, and declared that there was an iron curtain separating East and West.
Incidentally, that term I found goes back to 1921 already. It was current in his younger years.
Used by him?
No, not used by him, used by others. I found it in a book.
Applied where?
Applied to the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
1921.
Well, now, was that a moment when creative statesmanship might have been used? We know that Bertrand Russell, of all people, suggested that we give an ultimatum to the Soviet Union, that they liberate Eastern Europe or we go back to war. Now, perhaps that was inconceivable, but I want to hear your judgment on whether we were too slack in those early days when we had the monopoly on nuclear power.
Well, in theory, yes. In practice, no. If you recall these times, we've just finished the war. It would have been impossible to mobilize public opinion against the Soviet Union, just as it was impossible for Churchill to do the same thing in 1919, 1920 against the Soviet Union. Churchill was the first statesman in Europe to realize what a threat communism represented to the world. And he tried to mount an international crusade, and he got absolutely nowhere. Because people were tired, people were fatigued, people thought, you know, it's just not worth it. And I recall these days well, because I just was discharged from the army and I became a young Soviet expert. I think psychologically would have been quite impossible for any administration to do that.
All right, well now, let's assume that that was correct. I was in my last days in the infantry attached to a separation center, so I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. People just want to get
People
out.
Stampeding home.
That's right, yeah. Then there were a series of devastating offensives, of which the Czechoslovakian coup in '48 was a big one. Then there was the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
Now that galvanized really the beginning of the hardening defensive posture. Was there an alternative to the way Truman handled the Berlin, not the Berlin Wall, the Berlin blockade? Was there an alternative to the way that was handled?
Well, the Berlin blockade he handled very well. I think we didn't handle very well the Berlin Wall. I think we could have knocked it down with impunity, and we should have done it.
Aha. Well, now, if we had done it, we know that Khrushchev had ordered 5 divisions of troops to edge up on Berlin. Is it your assumption that he would have retreated?
It's blackmail. Their policy throughout the Cold War was always to avoid a direct confrontation. And whenever we confronted them, they backed off. In every case, with Cuba being the most, perhaps, memorable one. Basically, Soviet policy during the Cold War era was one of blackmail, and particularly after 1949 of nuclear blackmail. And where our weakness showed up was in yielding to that blackmail, the notion that somehow we must accommodate the Soviet Union to avoid World War III.
Well, aren't you contradicting yourself by suggesting that if we hadn't yielded that blackmail, we might have accelerated the political demise?
I don't know if it would accelerate the political demise, but I think we might have perhaps shifted the psychological balance in our favor, which may have forced the Soviet Union to conduct these reforms earlier. I don't know. This is a big iffy question. But these were, my view is that fundamentally we conducted very often a very appeasing policy because we yielded to the blackmail. I do not know whether it would have had a great effect on what happened to the Soviet regime, because I think the Soviet regime essentially collapsed as a result of internal developments, not external.
Well, would you connect historically the ouster of Khrushchev with the failure of the Cuban venture?
It was only one of the many factors. I think he was accused of harebrained scheme in general, of acting impulsively in regard to Cuba, in regard to China, in his very impulsive reforms inside, agricultural reforms, introduction, for example, of corn where it wasn't suitable and so on. People just felt that he was not a reliable leader. But Cuba was one of the factors.
My informants tell me that it was Brzezinski who wrote the phrase, the inordinate fear of communism, that was used by Jimmy Carter in his speech at the commencement exercise at Notre Dame in 1979. I was invited to give the next commencement speech, which I devoted to an examination of that subject. Now, and by an inordinate fear of communism, what did you understand the Carter administration to be telling us? That we were spending too much money on defense? What other expression of such an inordinate fear was there in the decade that saw a third of the population of Cambodia gutted by communists,
Of course, it was
and that ushered in 1.4 million deaths in Afghanistan?
a very, very unfortunate expression. I think what they meant is we were too fixated on the Soviet Union, and we were ignoring other problems in the world, such as overpopulation and poverty in the third world.
Well, that isn't what inordinate means. I mean, you think he used the wrong word.
Well, he meant that it is, of course, a danger to us, but it's not the only danger.
Obsessive.
Obsessive, all right. But there were other dangers, too, by which, they may not...
Like cancer.
Well, domestic problems, homelessness,
Adultery.
poverty, this. So instead of being so fixated on the communist danger, which they didn't, certainly I know Brzezinski would not have denied, and nevertheless, there are other problems in the world, too, which are equally dangerous in the long run.
Yeah, but Brzezinski, of course, was the center of his entire life, has been the communist threat and how to cope with it. So it's odd for it to have come from him. I'm not here to undress Brzezinski psychologically. It's just that I wonder how you would fix that particular remark, which gets picked up so frequently.
Well, I'll tell you, when I got to Washington in '81, I got immediately into trouble by giving an interview to a Reuters correspondent who broke the agreement with me they'll be off the record and published it. Soon my name floated to the surface, and it sounded terribly menacing. And I was in deep trouble. And an old Washington hand said...
What did you say? I forgot.
I said something that actually I still believe is correct, that the Soviet Union is in such a critical position that it must either reform internally or go to war. It has no other choice.
I remember, yeah.
But the way this was presented in the press was, particularly by the communist press, is that we give an ultimatum, that a high White House official was giving an ultimatum to the Soviet Union: you must either adopt capitalism or we'll attack you, which is, of course, not at all what I meant. But then an old Washington hand told me, he says, look, when the president says 2 + 2 is 5, as far as you're concerned, it is 5. Now, I imagine that President Carter laid down the line, that this is what's to be done. And if you're in politics, you have to do that. If you don't like it, you resign. My good fortune has been I've always been outside of politics, except for these 2 years. And even then, I wasn't always playing by the rules. So I could always say what I had in my mind. And I imagine if Brzezinski wanted to stay in the position which he had, if indeed he's the author of that statement, he had to formulate what the president wanted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, externalize what was going on in Carter's own mind.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, now, when you found yourself in the head of the Russian desk in Reagan's first couple of years, had you at that point formulated what you later expressed, namely a prediction that there would be a demoralization and subsequently a coup? Mm-hmm. Or were you at that point still wondering whether the Soviet Union might end up by winning the Cold War? Was it an open question in your judgment?
I had no doubt that they would not win the Cold War. The only question was how long the Cold War would go on. Mm-hmm. I thought much of it was unnecessary, that we could conduct a much tougher policy and perhaps speed up the process, which is what, as I've said, psychologically the president achieved in a way. But it was the only time in my life where I spent 2 solid years doing nothing but working on current materials. And what they persuaded me was of the following, that the intentions of the Soviet government were even more malevolent than I had thought, but their capabilities were smaller. And I became very much aware of the rottenness of the whole system. And my view was, and this view I was pressing on the government, was we should press them as hard as we can, because they're not dangerous, really.
Were you in part responsible for the enthusiasm with which Reagan attacked the problem of theater nuclear weapons in Europe?
No, not for that. I had an influence on, for example, such pronouncements of his as a speech in London, the Westminster speech in '82, where he said that the system in the Soviet Union is so rotten. There's such, I smuggled in the Marxist language.
The ash heap.
Yeah, that really infuriated them in Moscow. That there's a fundamental contradiction between the political system and the socioeconomic system, but not on our side, on their side, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think when the president pronounced this, it had a very demoralizing effect on them.
Yeah. Now, when he pronounced it as an evil empire, were you shocked, or did you consider that to be consistent with the moral offensive that you were trying to generate?
To tell the truth, I was a bit queasy about the expression. I was asked about it. I know who coined it. It was one of the speechwriters.
I do too.
And he called me. I said, you know, I, as a scholar, find it very difficult to approve of such expressions. But then, when he pressed me and said, well, would you say that about Nazi Germany? Would you have trouble saying Nazi Germany was evil? I said, no, I wouldn't. And then I agreed that perhaps it was a good expression. And the first reaction of a scholar is we just don't use such terms.
Right.
But it was a very powerful term, and it made a tremendous impression in Russia. Everywhere you go there, they ask you.
Oh, it did?
Oh, yes. Everybody that thinks I coined it. So I always say, no, I didn't. But they mean it approvingly.
Right.
I was in Moscow a few months ago, and I was at a meeting. First question was, have you coined the expression, evil empire? I said, unfortunately not. And they like that.
Now, what about SDI? Did that have a significant impact on the strategic hopes of the Soviet military?
Well, we don't know really, you know. I think it worried them tremendously, and they pulled out all the stops. They went to work with all the propaganda machine to influence scientific community in the West and politicians in the West to stop it.
Yeah.
All I can say is that the magnitude of the effort suggested they were very worried about it. And the reason was that they, of course, had a first strike theory. And if SDI had even been 25% successful in intercepting the missile, I think it would throw such uncertainty into first strike that the whole strategy would have to be altered.
Ms. Pipes, let me ask you in 5 remaining minutes to talk about the future. In a piece you wrote the very day that the coup began, you signaled out Shevardnadze for special tribute. Is it your opinion that he has for a long time been the prime mover in the direction of glasnost and perestroika?
I think in the field of foreign policy particularly, not domestic policy, but in foreign policy, I think he was a key player. I think it is he who persuaded Gorbachev that the Soviet Union has to pull out of Eastern Europe, or at least modify the regimes in Eastern Europe, because it could not maintain the present regimes, either by force or by economic aid.
Now, this is a deduction from his written material or simply from sources?
Well, it's just everything adds up to it.
Both.
He was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was very close to Gorbachev during this period. And everything we know about him suggests that he was not the only player in this, but I think he was a very powerful factor.
Now, you said in that same column, which was prophetic, that if Gorbachev survived the coup, which of course he has, it was very unlikely that he would have a significant political future. Do you stand by that prediction?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Tell us why.
Well, first of all, he has no base left anymore. Any politician must have a base. His base was the Communist Party. That Communist Party is in process of dissolution. He had to dissolve it because of his complicity in the coup. The other base could be popular consent, popularity.
Has he a chance to win that? Well, I know he doesn't have it, but might he win it?
It's down to 4%. It's very interesting when you look at I saw a comparison between American...
That's less than Lyndon LaRouche.
Yeah, something like that. Popularity in this country of Gorbachev is something like 60-odd%, and Yeltsin something like 15%. In the Soviet Union, Yeltsin is 60-some% and Gorbachev is 4%. Well, then to answer your question, he has no base. He has neither a Communist Party nor popular support. So if he gets through the elections to the post of president, as he's promised to do, he's certain to lose.
Then he will be defeated even in elections which he has set up.
Oh, absolutely. There's not a ghost of a chance he would win. He is only kept there because the republics are a little bit afraid of Moscow and of Russia. He serves as a buffer, say, between Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Yeltsin. And he also is a person who is very popular abroad, therefore he might bring some aid. But as far as domestic authority is concerned, is next to nil.
Well, now, do you think that Mr. Bush has moved too strenuously to prolong Gorbachev's political life?
Absolutely, yes. I think he's sold on Gorbachev. I don't know quite why. People say that he forms very close personal attachments, and he feels comfortable with him. He doesn't feel comfortable with, say, Yeltsin. That may be one explanation. The other explanation is that Washington very much fears that a Soviet Union that disintegrates into 15 republics will be balkanized and may become very dangerous.
Do you say that here?
No. Well, there will be undoubtedly problems. I mean, if the Soviet Union disintegrates, there'll be territorial problems, there'll be economic problems, and so on. There'll be the same problems we had after World War I, when Europe...
Frontier tensions.
Yes, and when you had in the colonial areas after World War II. But national self-determination is not going to be stopped by these concerns. So we must sooner or later recognize the fact that the Soviet Empire, which is the last empire in the world, is not sustainable. Mr. Bush was very ill-advised when he went to Kiev, capital of Ukraine, 2 or 3 months ago, and preached to them that they can have happiness without independence.
In your judgment, do the events post-Kiev, have they instructed Mr. Bush, or is there still a strong school within the State Department that says, let's hang on to Gorbachev because he is a symbol of national unity and is probably indispensable to some kind of a loose confederation?
I'm afraid it's the latter, and it has a lot to do with the fate of nuclear weapons. There's the fear also of what happens with nuclear weapons. So what's now being done in Washington is pursuit of what they call a two-track policy. We deal with the Soviet government first and foremost, and also independent of the republics, but we always give preference to the central government. I think it's basically a mistaken policy, and I'm quite confident will have to be abandoned before long.
Well, would you actually recommend the recognition of an independent Ukraine government as of the moment the Ukraine declares itself to be independent?
Absolutely.
You would do so?
As we should have done in the case of the 3 Baltic republics, first and not last, we will have to do that. There's no way stopping the Ukraine.
So you attach zero importance to the affinity that Bush and Gorbachev seem to have for each other. You don't think that's politically important?
It's important for Gorbachev because he may that way obtain loans and credits and aid from the West. From our point of view, it means very, very little.
So that we should be very, very blasé about the prospect of the balkanization of the Soviet Union.
Well, we have to be concerned, but my view is this, that no matter what trouble we will have in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union in the years to come because of disintegration of that monstrous empire, it will be much less of a danger to us than the Soviet Empire had been.
Does this assume the repatriation of all nuclear weapons into Russia?
I think that's what will happen, exactly what will happen.
Now, can that as a practical matter be done quickly? Or is this a 2-3 year?
No, that's relatively easy because the bulk of them are in the Russian Republic anyway. They always were stationed in the Russian Republic. The strategic weapons, that is.
Yes.
I think a Russia detached from the Soviet Union is far less of a danger than a Russia which runs the Soviet Union. So yes, there will be troubles, but I think it'll be minor compared to the Cold War threats we faced for 40-odd years.
Now, to what extent are the reformers, the economic reformers within the Soviet Union, wedded to free trade principles between the republics?
They are and they aren't. You know, everything there is very ambivalent. They would tell you that the Union has disintegrated, but then in the next breath they'll talk about economic reforms in the Union. They'll tell you, yes, we are for the market, but we want a regulated market. We want capitalism, but we don't want unemployment, and so on and so forth. They're very confused, and it's very difficult to say what they really believe in. Just like people who have spent all their life in prison and suddenly are let out.
That's yeah.
I have to cut you off, Professor Pipes. Mr. Buckley, the phrase was inordinate fear of communism, not inordinate military opposition to communism or inordinate moral revulsion against communism. Surely one logical meaning of that is a belief, an inordinate belief that communism can work as a political and economic system. And didn't the United States, in hindsight, and especially, if I might say so, conservatives, weren't they a little bit too optimistic about the ability of the Soviet Union to sustain itself economically, to continue to grow both economically and as a military power? And didn't this internal crumbling that Professor Pipes talked about catch the United States by surprise?
Well, I think we went through a period when that was correct. Mr. Schwartz of the New York Times in 1958 predicted that by 1970 the Soviet Union would outproduce per capita the United States. And there was a fear that some crazy productive thing was going on in the Soviet Union. A 60 Minutes episode 1972 flashed through Moscow and said, my God, you can find everything there. Granted, they don't have much liberty, but liberty is a scarce commodity. But the feeling then was that the Soviet Union was bringing it off. It had discovered electricity and was on the march. It was, but the conservatives, I think, far in advance of the liberals, believed that there was a central degeneration going on there.
But the conservatives tended to believe that, yes, the economy can't possibly work, but you can oppress people indefinitely and always squeeze out enough more for the military.
Correct.
That turned out not to be true.
Well, it's true in China so far.
Is it true in the Soviet? Would turn out not to be true. I call in my expert witness on this point.
Well, I mean, if in '85 Gorbachev had not decided to tamper with the system and reform an essentially unreformable system, they could have still been going on today. The system had enough life left in it to go on for another 5 or 10 years. Sooner or later, they would have had to do something. But let us not, rewrite history and say because it happened, it had to happen. It did not have to happen. I think
remember that, Michael.
I'll keep it in mind.
Bear in mind that I think that the collapse of the communism happened because the communist leaders were victims of their own propaganda. They really thought it was a sound system they had, and they could play around with it and revitalize it and still keep it in place. And it turned out the whole thing crumbled in their hands.
Thank you very much, Professor Pipes, Mr. Kinsley, ladies and gentlemen of St. Elizabeth's College.
Next week on Firing Line, William F. Buckley Jr. talks with Congressman Carl Purcell and businessman Ed Donnelly about the president's plan for American businesses to provide funds for experimental schools as a means of improving education. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the